Let me say a few things about the genealogy of Jesus as another kind of legend, this time a legend that is in the New Testament. The gospel accounts. The Gospel of Mark does not have a genealogy, probably because it does not have an account of Jesus' birth. Mark's gospel begins with Jesus as an adult. The same is true with the Gospel of John. It begins with Jesus as an adult. Matthew and Luke, however, are the two Gospels in the New Testament that tell stories about Jesus being born. And so, in both Matthew and Luke, in addition to birth narratives, you also are given genealogies, in which you have the family line of Jesus traced back to his remote ancestors. Just a second, I don't want to get to historical reality yet. The interesting thing about the genealogies of Matthew and Luke, there are several interesting things. The most interesting thing to many modern readers is that the two genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke are different genealogies. They're different. They're different in a lot of ways. Some of the ways don't matter and some do matter. One way that may not matter is that Matthew's genealogy is set up to show that Jesus descended from King David and he descended from Abraham. And so the genealogy begins, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, who's that? Okay, so David is the greatest king in Jewish history, and it was understood that his descendant would be the future Messiah. And so by saying that Jesus is the son of David, Matthew is indicating that he's the Messiah. But he's also called the son of Abraham. Why Abraham? Because Abraham is the father of the Jews. The Jews trace their lineage back to Abraham. And so, Jesus' genealogy is traced back to Abraham. As many of you know, Matthew's gospel is often thought to be the most Jewish of the gospels, and so it traces Jesus' Jewish lineage. Luke's genealogy, in some ways, is even more interesting, because it does trace Jesus back to David and back to Abraham, but that's not the emphasis. Jesus' genealogy in Luke's gospel is traced back to Adam, as in Adam and Eve. That's a great genealogy. I have an aunt who's a genealogist who is very proud about the fact that she's traced my family line back to the Mayflower. The Mayflower to Adam and Eve. Serious genealogy. The logic of Adam's genealogy, of Luke's genealogy, is that unlike Matthew wants to show that Jesus is the Savior to the Jews, the Jewish Messiah, Luke wants to emphasize that Jesus is the Savior of all people, Jews and Gentiles. And so his line is traced back to the first human, to Adam himself. So that's a difference, but it's not a discrepancy or a contradiction, it's just a difference. The discrepancy is that the family line of Jesus is traced back through Joseph to David in different lines. Now, let me make a couple points about that. First, the genealogies are both genealogies of Joseph. That should strike you as very strange, because both Matthew and Luke insist that Jesus was born of a virgin. Joseph was not his father. But the genealogy is the genealogy of Joseph. But Jesus doesn't belong to that family line. Well, the Gospels don't give us an answer to that one. I think you have to assume that he was adopted by Joseph, and so he was sort of adopted into the line, but he's not part of the bloodline, which is the point of a genealogy. Neither of the Gospels trace the line of Mary. They're both tracing Joseph. But what is even more interesting is that they're different genealogies of Joseph. If you look carefully, you don't have to look too carefully, just read what it says. Ask yourself, who is Joseph's father? It depends whether you're reading Matthew or Luke. Who's his grandfather? Different names. Great-grandfather? Different names. Different names all the way from Joseph back to King David. In Matthew's genealogy, Joseph descends from David's son Solomon. In Luke's genealogy, he descends from David's son Nathan. Different. Well, how can that be? Well, it can't be, literally. What's going on here is that both of these authors want to trace the genealogy of Jesus, and the reality is they don't know. I mean, how would they know? People have this mistaken notion that in the ancient world, everybody kept detailed records of these things. People did not keep detailed records of these things. And so Matthew and Luke have had to do the best they could to come up with genealogies of Jesus for purposes of their own. The historical reality is we don't know who Joseph's father or grandfather or great-grandfather was. It's something we simply can't know. I should add, one of the interesting things about Matthew's genealogy is that it is clearly a constructed genealogy. Matthew goes through the genealogy from Abraham to David, and then he goes from David to the biggest disaster in the history of ancient Israel when they were destroyed by the Babylonians for the Babylonian exile that happened in the 6th century. And then he goes from the Babylonian exile down to Jesus. He divides it into thirds. And what he tells you, and it's when you add it up, he points out that there were 14 generations between Abraham and David, 14 generations between David and the Babylonian exile, and 14 generations between the Babylonian exile and the Messiah, Jesus. 14, 14, 14. It's almost as if something miraculous is happening every 14 generations in the history of Israel. So that this birth of Jesus, in fact, is almost like it's fulfilling a prophecy or something. It's part of the divine plan. The problem with that is that, well, there's several problems. One problem is that when you actually add up the numbers, the third set of 14 is actually only 13. He counted wrong. So that's a problem. The other problem is that you can compare the genealogy that Matthew gives you with the genealogy that he got it from the Old Testament, and he left out a few names in a few places. Why? Because he wanted the number 14. So it would be 14, 14, 14, so it would look like a miracle. It not only look like a miracle, there are several theories about this 14 thing. You know, ancient peoples really like numbers. Well, what is 14? Well, it's twice 7. 7 is the perfect number. This is a doubly perfect genealogy. The other interesting thing is that when you spell, okay, this is a little complicated. So, in ancient languages, they didn't use a different alphabetic system from their numerical system the way we do, right? We use Roman letters, but we use Arabic numerals. In ancient languages, they used the letters of the alphabet for their numbers. And so, for example, in Hebrew, Aleph, the first letter is worth 1, Beth is worth 2, Gimel is worth 3, and so on. And so every letter has a numerical value. If you spell the name David in Hebrew and add it up, remember the Messiah is to be the son of David? Spell David in Hebrew and add the letters up, 14, as it turns out. And so the 14, 14, 14 thing in Matthew may be a way of saying this really is the son of David. My point, though, is that it's a constructed genealogy. In other words, it's not something that you can go to the bank on as being historically accurate. It's not historically accurate. People wanted to say that Jesus had certain kinds of lineages, certain genealogical lineage, and they had to make up genealogies in order to pull it off, including the genealogies that ended up making it into the New Testament of Matthew and Luke. So another picture of Jesus' relatives, his ancestors.